Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. Bex here today to talk about all of the books that I read in quarter four of 2023. So it is my quarter four wrap up. All of the books that I read from October to December. I did technically finish a book this morning. I'm filming this in early January, but because I read most of it in December, I'm obviously just gonna include it here. I have 11 books to talk about, which is definitely a bit more than my other wrap-ups for 2023, mostly because I read a couple short, like, comic graphic novel things, so that's why. But because there's 11 to talk about, let's get started. The first one that I finished in quarter four is one of the Royal Diaries books. This is Marie Antoinette, and it's Princess of Versailles, Austria, France, 1769. This is the fourth book in this series that I have read. They're written by various authors. This one is Kathryn Lasky, so she wrote a few of them. But this is actually my second favorite of the four that I've read so far. The reason I enjoyed this one so much is because it kind of gave us a look into what Marie's life was like before she became Queen of France. I feel like a lot of the times what we see is after she's already in France and she's been married and she's like actually having to be the queen. And this really illustrates the innocence that Marie had and how she was one of many children. And her education maybe didn't really prepare her for what being queen would actually be like, because of course most of us know the fate of Marie Antoinette. The book does not get anywhere near that because this is a middle grade book, so they didn't kind of go down that route. But it does have stuff at the end, as all of these books do, that to give a lot of historical context. Most of the characters, except for I think two characters in this book, were real people, and the author was pulling from a lot of real facts and sort of made that point about how Marie wasn't really educated in the right way to make her a queen. And of course, with all of these books, it sort of encouraged me to want to pick up more. This is very much an introductory sort of thing because it is a middle grade book, but I really wanted to read something else about Marie that was maybe a bit, you know, a bit more mature, a bit more for adults, and just really get into the analysis of like why things happened the way they did. The next book that I finished was an audiobook, and it is Neither Snow Nor Rain, A History of the United States Postal Service by Devin, Leonard. If you've watched some of my recent videos, you'll know that I mentioned this in the Christmas tag video that I did because I recommended it as something that a friend should read. I recommended it to Les because she does love the USPS. I've always had a little bit of a fascination in terms of the history of the USPS and how they function, because there is so much being done with all of these letters and packages, and I was just sort of curious how that system came to be. So this is very much a book for USPS people. Like, it's not a book that I would recommend to just a general nonfiction reader who doesn't have an interest in this subject. There is a lot of history covered in here, obviously from the creation of the United States Postal Service and postal services around the world, and then all of the little stories, those like nitty-gritty stories that exist about the USPS, specific incidents that have happened, histories of when certain things couldn't be mailed because they were considered like blasphemous or whatever. So I got all of those little stories, which I really enjoyed. There were parts that kind of dragged a little bit, but I really did enjoy the audiobook narration. I think that's worth mentioning. The audiobook narration was really engaging, and I think that would help if you're maybe sort of interested in this, but a little wary. Audiobook narration is fantastic, but yeah, would not recommend this unless you are already interested in the USPS to some degree, just sort of understanding the history there. I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I finished was also an audiobook. Both of these were kind of on the shorter side, and I was doing a lot of cleaning and organizing, so I was listening to a lot of audiobooks. This is Your Favorite Band Is Killing Me, What Pop Music Rivalries Reveal About the Meaning of Life. This is by Stephen Hyden, and this one had been on my TBR for years. Same with Neither Snow Nor Rain, just both of those had been on my TBR list for, you know, probably 5-6 years at this point, and I borrowed the audiobooks from my library, so that was pretty easy. This one is kind of what you'd expect. It's looking at what these music rivalries meant and kind of how they bleed into pop culture, their lasting effect in some way. And so the author is very much in the music scene, like music journalism sort of thing. And so the angle that they take is a like a pretty intense angle. If you're not a music person, the first couple of chapters, which each chapter is kind of focusing on a different rivalry, more or less. It gets a little messier towards the end, but I was like, oh, I might be in over my head a little bit here. Like, I knew of the bands, but I didn't know necessarily a lot of their songs or their history. And so at certain points I was like, ooh, is this really the book for me? But it did get better as it went on. It just sort of depended on which bands he was talking about, or even just, you know, artists in general, like Michael Jackson versus Prince, Rolling Stones versus the Beatles. They even talked about Christina Aguilera and Britney Spears in there. And that does lead to another point about why I rated this book 3 stars, is I did feel like sometimes when he was writing about women artists, it just didn't quite sit right with me. So it just made me kind of feel a little iffy. And also some of the chapters towards the end just weren't as strong. I think there was just less to say, so it became more of like, you know, bunching things up. But he did have like Biggie and Tupac towards the end, which is something that I am, you know, now more aware of, but I was aware of it before, and sort of talking about how most of these rivalries, nothing really happened from them, but there was some ramifications from the Biggie and Tupac rivalry and what happened there. I would recommend this one only if you're already like really into the music scene. He does at least try to cover a wide range of genres of music, which I appreciated. But yeah, the way he talked about women a little bit, and it got a little weaker towards the end. Yeah, just not for everybody, but still an okay read. So as I mentioned, 3 stars. The next book is one that I owned on my TBR, and that is Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex by Angela Chen. This was one of the books that I wanted to read in 2023, and as you can see by the tabs, I had a very good time with this book. It was definitely an example of the right book at the right time. I'm gonna get a little personal here on the channel, which I don't really do very often, but my boyfriend, partner of 9+ years, we split up in September. And so for the first time in a long time, almost 10 years, I am single, and I'm a very different person than I was 10 years ago. There's a lot of things about me that are the same, but I've also experienced a lot of things in 10 years. I've grown and whatnot. And so I was thinking, like, this would be a good book to read now, because I have to think about what I'm looking for in a relationship now. And reading this book gave me a new perspective, not just on what asexuality is, but also just on like what I want out of a future relationship when that does happen. And that's why it was the right book at the right time. I tabbed the hell out of it, and I wanted to talk about it with other people, because I think this is a book that is beneficial to many people, not just people who might be questioning their sexuality, but just to sort of see things from a different lens. And the author identifies as asexual. They interview a number of people in here that also identify somewhere on the asexuality spectrum, and it was just really interesting to me to hear from people who have lived a little bit of a different life and look at things a bit differently, people who've made things work for them. And so yeah, it made me reflect on what I'm looking for going forward as someone who is 31 years old and now single for the first time in almost 10 years. So yeah, I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. If I had read this at a different point in my life, maybe I wouldn't have given it 5 stars and I wouldn't have tabbed the hell out of it. But right book at the right time. The next book that I finished was another short audiobook, because apparently that's my thing right now. American Fire, Love, Arson, and Life in a Vanishing Land by Monica Hesse. This is a nonfiction book. It's true crime, and it looks at a dramatic moment for a small community in Virginia in which over a number of months there were 50+ arsons of these buildings in the community, and people really had to rally because the resources of this community are not vast. It's very rural, poor community. And so Monica looks at the people in that community, how it affected them, but also who the arsonists were. So you learn about them and their backstory and why they probably did something like this. So I think this is one of those books that I will probably forget a lot about it and forget that I have read it until it shows up on my Goodreads list when I'm scrolling through. I'll be like, oh yeah, I read that book. I gave it 3.75 out of 5. Like, it wasn't a bad book or anything, but I just don't think it's going to stick with me the way some other books that I've read this year or even this quarter will. But if you're interested in reading it, if it's already on your list, I would recommend it. I did have a good time with it overall. Next are the two like comic book graphic novels that I read. I finally read Saga Volume 10 by Brian K. Vaughan, and then Fiona Staples is the illustrator. And this volume has been out for a while, but there was a big gap between volumes 9 and 10. So it's been a number of years since I read Volume 9. I did actually go on Wikipedia and read like quick summaries of each of the volumes because I've been reading these for so long, spread out over a number of years. And so I just wanted some reminders of like, not necessarily who the characters were, but like, what are they going through currently? Because I can picture a lot of the different characters because this is like a comic book. So you've got the pictures to remember everybody by. But yeah, this one I gave it 4 stars. It's not quite as devastating as the last volume. If you've read these books, you will know. Obviously, I can't get into much of the plot with a volume 10 because I don't want to spoil things for people who are behind me in reading the volumes or maybe haven't even started them yet. There's a lot of space travel, going to different planets. There's this big war that is happening between 2 different factions of people and how it's affecting everybody else. Yeah, this one, it hurt at the end. It wasn't quite as bad as volume 9, but it did definitely make me a bit sad. And I believe volume 11 is out now, but I don't think my library has it yet because that's where I've been getting all of these from. But I will definitely be continuing once it becomes available to me. The other thing that I read was just a cute little graphic novel that I've seen around, and it's The Tea Dragon Society by Kay O'Neill. I've seen a few different people talk about this, and my library happened to have it, so I thought I would check it out. And it's very sweet, very cute. I realized it as I was reading it that it was probably for a younger audience. It wasn't written to be something cozy for adults. It was written to be something cozy and cute for kids. And so that became evident at the end that it was mentioned that the story was written for a younger audience because things were definitely, there were some, tough things that were addressed, but they were addressed in a very like soft, sensitive way. I wasn't quite expecting that, but this story was simple and sweet. As I said, it's got beautiful artwork. Like, I just love the colors that are in it. And so I was just leaning towards 3 stars because it's good, it's cute. But then I also really want like a tea dragon now, specifically the Rooibos tea dragon. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not a tea drinker. Rooibos was adorable. I loved reading the little bits at the end of the book that talked about the different types of tea dragons. So now I want a Rooibos tea dragon. So I decided to bump up my rating to a 4. So yeah, it's a super fast read. I basically read it in one sitting, and it's cute. If you want something light with beautiful colors, knowing that it's not gonna be too deep, this is the book for you. My next book was much more serious, and that is The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power by Desmond Cole. This is a book that looks at Black lives in the year 2017 in Canada. So this is a very much a Canadian focused book, which is something I was excited about, being somebody that lives in Canada. And this looks at the year 2017 because that year was the 150th anniversary of the existence of Canada as a country. And so it was looking back at how things have not changed since then, specifically for Black people, not just Black Canadians, but Black immigrants. And then it also does have an Indigenous and LGBTQ plus focus as well, which I wasn't expecting as much. But there's some overlap there in terms of the government treatment, what the government has done to people in those communities, the rules, the crackdowns that they've done. They bleed into each other a bit, so they had to be addressed. And this is written from the perspective of Desmond Cole. Each chapter is a month in the year, and he focuses on something that happened that month, an event or a particular person or a crime or something like that that relates back to many things in Canadian history. So he was making all of these connections, mentioning a lot of different people, past and present, but it is very Ontario focused, I will say that. It's a book that I would say if you're Canadian, I would definitely recommend it. If you're well versed in a lot of these issues already, then maybe this wouldn't be necessarily the one for you, because I do think it's a good starting point, because he does jump around to different things depending on what's happening that month. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. It's more for the people who are just getting into this topic, but still definitely worth my time, still very good. For some of the time that I was reading The Skin We're In, I was also listening to the audiobook of Seven Fallen Feathers, Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City by Tanya Talaga. This is another Canadian book. The northern city in reference here is Thunder Bay, Ontario. There was a number of overlaps between what I was reading in The Skin We're In and what I was reading in Seven Fallen Feathers. Seven Fallen Feathers is in reference to 7 Indigenous kids that died in Thunder Bay within a smaller period of time. It's not all within 1 year like The Skin We're In, although it does focus mostly on the 7 Fallen Feathers, those children in the early 2000s. It does back up in time and talk about residential schools in the 1960s, talk about a bit of the history there. And it looks not only at the incompetence and the just racism in Thunder Bay with the Thunder Bay police, it also looks at Canada's human rights violations when it comes to the treatment of Indigenous peoples. I did feel the weight of listening to this audiobook and then also reading The Skin We're In at the same time. It was probably a little too much at once. There was actually, you know, not only the mention of like the multiple connections of Canada's treatment of different people, but also even like somebody named Julian Falconer was mentioned, a lawyer, was mentioned in both of these books. So I found that interesting that there was even just overlap of a particular person. And then of course like Canadian systemic racism, like that was both, you know, it's prevalent in both of these books. And so yeah, it was a heavy read, but I do think reading stuff that is very Canadian focused rather than more US focused it's important. Even if I hadn't been reading The Skin We're In at the same time, this book was heartbreaking. And it was really hard to hear over and over again what happened to these kids and how the systems that were supposed to help them just didn't care. And it also just gave me more context regarding Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples. Like I definitely know things now, but every time I read something about this topic, I always learn a little bit more, a little bit, you know, another tidbit here, another tidbit there. So yeah, it's not an easy book to read, but it's an important read, especially as somebody that lives in Canada. I am now going to give you Whiplash, and we're going to go back in the other direction from super serious stuff and talk about a cozy mystery that I read, Feel the Bern, a Bernie Sanders mystery by Andrew Schaffer, not entirely sure how to pronounce his last name. This is a book that Les got for me. She also got a copy for herself, and the plan was that we would both read it at the same time, and then we would film a review together in December when we saw each other over the Christmas break. And that didn't end up happening. We both read it at the same time in December, but we didn't end up filming the review because each of our families, there were people that got COVID and we just didn't want to get together and potentially pass stuff around. So unfortunately, we had plans to film a couple of videos and it didn't work out. I'm sorry guys, but we did both read this book, so I'm at least going to talk about it now. And this follows Crash Robertson, who's like a Gen Z intern working for Bernie Sanders on the Hill. She's a political science grad student. Bernie Sanders decides to do this parade in a small town of Vermont. The small town is not real. Eagle Creek does not actually exist, but it's where Crash is from. And so she accompanies Bernie to her small town for this festival. While they're there, someone gets murdered. And there's a little bit of upheaval in the town, not only because somebody gets murdered, but because this tech guy has come in and he's using robots now to try and capitalize on maple syrup and buying out all of these smaller farms. Obviously, Crash and Bernie end up investigating. There are a lot of things that just are kind of like, okay, you have to suspend your disbelief a lot for this book. However, I will say there were a couple of good Vermont references. I was keeping track of some of them. There are some things that I was like, yeah, no, that doesn't fly. But there are some things that I was like, yeah, no, that's true. I did have some fun with it, but I wouldn't really recommend it. I gave it a 2.5 out of 5. If you go into it knowing that it's just gonna be like a goofy, silly, good time, great. I think it's going to be a series just because it does say like #1 on Goodreads, Bernie Sanders Mystery #1. I don't know if I'd necessarily read #2, but it was still semi-enjoyable. The last book that I finished, that I started in Q4, was The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon. So this is the book that I just finished this morning. I read it as an audiobook and I started listening to it because I was driving home for Christmas and I thought this would be a good theme, because this book also takes place in Vermont. It takes place in another fictional location, but it references a lot of other real places in the state. And we're following a couple different characters, different timelines. And so this is a very like creepy, it's got a little element of horror, a little bit of a thriller aspect going on, but it does have a supernatural side to it. So for somebody that likes to read a thriller or a mystery and they want everything to really be rooted in reality, this isn't quite that. There is a supernatural element to this. I did find myself feeling very tense at times because I wanted to know what the hell was going on. You're slowly figuring things out with this plot, the storyline that takes place in the early 1900s in this fictional town, and then you have a plot line in the present day where a couple different characters come together, but they're all taking place in the same locale, and so you're getting fed information from both ends, and so you're sort of figuring things out as other characters do. And so the reveals, sometimes I would be like, just tell me what's going on, just tell me. I was feeling so tense, especially coming home, because on the way back I was getting more to like the climax of the book, and so it was just, I want to know what's going on. And I would, you know, driving on the 401 back like through Toronto, and I'm like, just tell me, just tell me. I haven't even fully decided what my rating of this book is yet. It's definitely not lower than a 3, but it's not higher than a 4. So it's probably more like a 3.5, because there were parts of the ending that I was kind of like, okay, that wasn't great. But there were other things that I really liked in this book, and I did think she did a great job of like building the suspense. I just think that the suspense I was feeling, like the pressure in my chest and like the electric feeling in my body of like what is going on, was better than the payoff at the end, which does happen sometimes with certain books. So yeah, it was a good book for this time of year, because it takes place in the winter time in January, and so it's, you know, there's snowy, it's cold, it's dark, and that's very much what this time of year is as well. So I definitely listened to it at the right time, but yeah, it just didn't quite pay off in the end the way I was really hoping it would. And then I do want to mention one other thing that I'm currently reading still, The Passage. I started this book in October. It is like 750 plus pages, so I wasn't necessarily expecting to finish it by the end of the year. It would have been kind of a minor miracle if I did. But at this point, as of right now, I'm at page 575, and I will just say that I am really enjoying it. The first part of this book was what I thought the entire thing was going to be about because of the inside flap. And then the book took a turn that I wasn't expecting, and I love the turn that it took. And so that's great for me, because I am loving everything since then. I'm just terrified that it's going to take another turn at some point and it will not be what I'm loving about this anymore, but I'm hoping that this continues. There are parts of this book that are long-winded for sure, but it's still like so good. This has really surprised me with how much I ended up liking it since it kind of took that turn. So yeah, at some point you'll probably hear more about this book once I finished it, but just letting you know that I am reading this and I'm enjoying it. Okay, those are all of the books that I read in Q4. Whew. If you have any thoughts on the books that I read, any comments, if you've read them too, you can let me know down below. All of our links are in the down bar too, so you can check those out if you feel so inclined. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you later.